this first video, you will learn about the main concept of urban sustainability transitions and how to manage this complex process. We will also focus at the mission of the Climate Neutral Cities by 2030 initiative, launched by Viable Cities, and you will also get a summary of the basics about how Viable Cities support urban transition management. In Sweden and in all of Europe, many actors are mobilizing to make cities climate neutral by 2030. There are different definitions of climate neutrality, and we generally use the term to describing reducing our carbon emissions to near zero and emitting only as much as nature can absorb. In her book, Mission Economy, economist Mariana Mazzucato examines the success of the Apollo program, which put man on the moon in the 1960s. She compares this with today's biggest and most complex challenges, such as climate change. The moon mission wasn't just about the space technology. At the time, most of the solutions didn't exist, like clothing, materials, communications, and food that people needed to be able to actually go into space. The mission enabled a lot of innovation in different sectors, all driven by one big goal. With the mission-oriented approach, Mazzucato likens the challenge of tackling climate change to the mission to the moon, where all parts of society needs to work together over a long period of time to complete the mission. However, unlike the moon mission, where a large but limited number of scientists and experts had to work together, tackling climate change is a much more challenging mission that requires the cooperation of a huge number of people. They are not given public funding either to focus on developing solutions, but are even expected to do so voluntarily to fund the development of climate-friendly innovations themselves. And we still need people and organizations to do this, because we cannot afford to fail in this mission, and governments alone cannot finance and manage climate change. When we adopt the mission-oriented innovation in the transition context at the city level, we aim to mobilize all actors and sectors of local society to work together, align their efforts, and develop holistic solutions that drastically reduce their emissions. Emission in a city can come from many sectors, such as transport, heating, energy, industry, construction, and consumption. Sometimes a service or a product itself has direct emissions, such as electricity as a service, or when we put petrol in our car, which is a product. But sometimes emissions are part of the production process. For example, construction of a building. So if we want to make a city climate neutral, we need to develop climate-friendly alternatives of services, products, and production processes. To do this, we need a lot of innovations, both technological and social innovations, including new methods, approaches, and practices. And we also need investment in their development and production. This process is called the transition to a sustainable future, and this is what Swedish cities are working on together with Viable Cities, the mission Climate Neutral Cities by 2030. Consequently, this series of workshops will focus on the management side of transition. What does this mean in practice? Well, up to now, all organizations, here is the example of the municipality, but we can substitute it with any other type of organization. They have done both the planning and the implementation of the plans within the institutional framework. However, in transition, we need organizations to align their plans with the mission to climate neutrality and also with each other to increase efficiency and sustainability. Both planning and implementation will be the joint responsibility of the so-called arena, made up of quadruple helix sectors: business, academia, citizens, and public organizations, including the local government. We call this network governance, which becomes the heart or the engine of the transition process. Let's zoom into a city using the model used by Viable Cities in the Climate Neutral Cities 2030 initiative. Viable Cities invites municipalities to create a transition team, which is an intermediary team that supports the transition process. Their main objective is to set up the transition arena and support their work. The arena will be them responsible for developing the climate plans summarized in the Climate City contract. The Climate City contract is one of the tools used to align multiple stakeholders with the transition. It is an agreement between municipalities, national agencies, and viable cities, in which all parties undertake to make a concrete contribution to accelerating the climate transition. Within the local transition arena, they also run experiments to demonstrate on a small scale the transformational changes needed at the city scale, and they will ultimately be responsible for implementing the transition plans. In addition to supporting the arena, the transition team is also seeking to trigger systemic change within the local government, as it has a special role to play in this process. First, the municipality hosts the transition team and supports or leads the transition process. Second, the municipality is also a member of the arena, so it participates in the development of the transition plans. And finally, it needs to change its internal governance model from treating climate change as a single project among hundreds of others to an overarching process that influences planning and decision making, and that unifies siloed governance structures into a holistic climate governance. So this is the model of viable cities when we zoomed in on one city. There is also a vertical perspective of the viable cities model, where we find the transition arena at the local level, supported by viable cities at the national level, where viable cities support several municipalities across Sweden that want to become climate neutral. Viable Cities provides both financial and expert support to cities to empower them and build their capacity to develop their own transition processes. One of the key tools provided by Viable Cities is the Transition Lab forums, a kind of living labs for accelerated learning. In these forums, the cities meet physically for a number of days, 3 times a year, to learn from experts, reflect on their own work, and exchange experiences. At the national level, we also find governmental agencies that are actively involved in the transition work and that provide funding for viable cities to distribute it to cities. Both the agencies and viable cities sign the Climate City contract together with the municipalities, who in their contract represent the local transition arena. Finally, at the regional level, we can find regional governments, mobilizing for climate transition together with regional bodies and municipalities. If we zoom out from Sweden, we find 112 mission cities at the EU level that are mobilizing towards the same mission with support from the European Commission. 7 of them are Swedish cities, all also part of the Viable Cities program. The Net Zero Cities Consortium is helping mission cities on this journey by providing capacity building workshops, summer universities, and tailored support similarly to the Transition Lab forums. Viable Cities is also a member of the Net Zero Cities Consortium. At the same time, it also requires a shift from traditional governance approach towards holistic climate governance based on mission-oriented projects linked together in a mission-oriented portfolio. The climate smart portfolio planning goes beyond projectification. What does it mean? Many organizations work on a project basis. They get a good part of their budget through projects. In Swedish municipalities, they can take up to 60-70% of the annual budget. Projects have their own project logic. They often require cooperation between different organizations, but planning and implementation remain within institutional boundaries. While in transition, organizations need to co-create joint plans and implement them together. There needs to be a shift from traditional governance to network governance. Projects are usually short-term, 1, 2, 3 years long, and they are not interconnected. Once a project ends, the systemic framework does not promote any follow-up on its achievements or of its network. The project consortium established disappears after the project ends, together with the knowledge accumulated by its members. In contrast, transition governance requires long-term mission-oriented planning, where projects are interlinked and built on each other to achieve a single mission goal of climate neutrality. Project work is mainly focused on deliverable. Therefore, the network created by the project, the quality of the collaboration, the lessons learned in the process, and the impact of the project on the system, if it changes the business as usual models, are all of secondary importance. In contrast, the focus of transition governance is on learning and transformation, because complex challenges such as climate change require complex long-term solutions that induce large-scale systemic change. We need to reform our processes, methods, and behavior by inventing and failing, and then adapting and reinventing, and in this process, continuously learning and disseminating the lessons to all segments of society. It is an iterative process based on a series of experiments. Instead of a linear project implementation focused on the deliverables, trials and errors create a spiral of learning curves. Finally, as a significant part of the municipality's budget comes from projects, this makes them dependent on project funding. Governments or the EU distribute funding through calls for projects, which are usually restricted in their focus and provide very little room for maneuvering for municipalities or organizations. Instead of dealing with the issues that are most important to municipalities on a continuous and long-term basis, they are forced to deal with issues that are deemed important by the funding organizations. But climate change, because of its scale and complexity, requires a far greater investment than government could ever fund. It will require contributions from almost every organization in the local economy. Co-financing is therefore the engine of transition governance.